All right, guys, so today we're going to take a look at is lesson 12, which is 3D effects. What we're going to look at is how to build 3D environments. So when I say 3D, it's actually going to be like a flat image and then some different elements. But we're going to take a look at some stuff that actually like makes it feel like a three-dimensional environment. So we'll take a look at things like lighting, how you can change angles and like control how like lighting not just affects the new pieces that you add in After Effects, but how it'll actually like affect everything in the environment. So it's actually really cool. Like it does some really interesting stuff. A little bit of terminology stuff too that helps, especially considering like a lot of this is almost like video editing, where how you're kind of clipping through things. So there's a little bit of like terminology stuff that I think will be helpful, just kind of like looking for towards like that as a thing you may end up doing. I never thought like getting into like even starting with web design that I'd end up like cutting video, but it's kind of a cool skill to have, and it's definitely like, it's definitely become a piece of my business, doing stuff with After Effects, creating like little promo stuff, social media, that kind of thing. So it's nice to kind of like be able to tie some of those skill sets together. Now that we're kind of like getting somewhere with timeline-based editing, you guys are actually going to see like if you went into actual video editing, it's like just kind of a hop and a skip and a jump to doing that as well. And it's actually a little bit less complicated because there's just so many less parameters with video. It's really just kind of overlaying things. So just kind of like a nice tie into that. So we'll take a look at creating those environments, creating some three-dimensional text, playing around with the different axes that you can put them on, animating cameras, adding some lights, and then just playing around some different effects that we can work on here. So what we're going to do first is, if you guys take a look on Blackboard, everything is inside here in our lesson 12. All your assets, if you take a look, there it is. It's just Lunar, this MP3, and then this background that we're going to use. So we're going to use those as our asset points, and I'm going to jump right into After Effects so that we can start building this stuff out. Again, if you guys have any questions as we're going, feel free to shout them out, or if you want to throw them in the chat, either way works fine. You just want to make sure everybody's kind of following along, making sure that this all makes sense to them. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new composition for this. So I'm going to call this thing Lunar. Just give it a name right off the bat. I'm going to use a standard preset here. I'm going to use this HD TV. I'm going to do the 24. So remember, like what that basically shows for, or what that refers to is this, your frame right here. So I'm going to do 24 frames per second. I'll do full resolution so everything looks good. And then for my duration, I'm going to set this thing to 3 seconds exactly. And then the other thing I want to take a look at, and we haven't really done a lot with this yet, is I'm going to set my background color. Normally it just defaults to white. I'm going to just make sure that this is set to black. So you can click in there, select a background color, click OK, and you can set that as your default. So this is really what I'm looking at to get started with. Now, what I want to do is I want to make some text here, but what I'll need to do is once I have the text built, I'll have to convert it into a three-dimensional object, which is actually really, really simple. So what I want to do first is I'm just going to grab my type tool. I'm going to click somewhere in the center here. And I think I'm going to do all caps. And I want to play around with my text settings here. So I'm going to go with Futura. And take a look. I got a couple of different settings. I'm going to go with a bold. And then I want to play around just kind of the size and the overall just look of this thing. So for my text size, I'm going to go pretty big with this. So it's about 140. Here, I want to play around with my leading. This is just a little too loose. I want to kind of pull this together a little bit. If you want to adjust tracking, really what we're doing, and you can almost think of this as like certain texts work better for certain applications. We're making this three-dimensional. I want to kind of give this some depth, but I want to loosen up my tracking a little bit. I want to give myself a little bit of room, because when you think about this, this is going to pitch off to an angle, and there's going to be some depth to this. So I just want to give a little bit more looseness on that tracking. Other than that, I think it's in pretty good shape. I am going to check my paragraph panel and make sure that I'm centering this thing. So that all looks good. And I'm just going to center this right in the middle of my document here. And then now that I have this done, what I need to do is I need to turn on to make this thing three-dimensional, because right now it's just basically flat text. I'm seeing it right here. Keep in mind that on your timeline panel here, we've got all these different settings. So like, remember, we've got that motion smoothing. We've got this little icon right here. If we check this, it turns it into a three-dimensional layer. And now I'm seeing that I had control. I can control kind of where this thing sits. So I've got my y-axis, my x-axis, and my z-axis. So I can make it forwards, backwards, up, down. I can kind of control all those different points to this. So now that I have this thing turned on, I can actually take a look at all my different views. So right now, I'm just looking at this thing in one view. It's not something we've really played around with yet, but I think it's really helpful when you're looking at like working in a three-dimensional space. I can actually control my number of views here. So here I could go to 2, or I could go to 4 views, and it's going to show me top, front, right. It's going to show me what this is going to look like from all these different angles. Now you can see from the top and from the right, there's nothing to it. There's no thickness, so it just appears as a layer with a thin line, but I can see that depth forwards to backwards in the document. So it's actually acting like a three-dimensional space. So if you work with any like rendering programs or any sort of like three-dimensional design, generally you've got, normally we're working very flat when we're doing graphic design work. When we're looking at 3 dimensions, keep in mind that we've got this extra distance. We can bring things forwards or backwards and kind of play around with that. This also applies to lighting. So if we're going to pitch a light that's going to light the whole area or just spotlight one particular piece, we want to be able to see where that lighting is coming from and the angle that it's set from. So again, checking these views, and depending on how much screen size you have, you can kind of play around with that. I've got a bigger monitor that I'm working from, so I'll do 4. If you're working on like a smaller laptop, you can just set this to 2. And then remember too, from here, if I select, now I'm viewing the top view, I can change my view. So if I want to see front, left, right, bottom, I can kind of set all these different views of which angle I want to look at this from. But because I got the room, I'm just going to set it to 4 so I can see the fronts, the right, the top. I can kind of see all those different angles. Now, what I want to do is I want to get a background into this document so that we can kind of see what this is going to look like. But also, once I have a background in, now what I can do is I can start kind of playing around with lighting and seeing how it's going to affect different elements. So just got this basic like bold, blocky white text. Happy with it. Now what I want to do is get some other elements in here. So under my assets, got everything there. I'm going to double click inside this box to pull open my assets. And here it's just linked right to it on my desktop. I've got this lunar MP3 and I've got this space landscape. So I'm going to grab this landscape. I'm going to drag this thing down, and I can see here on my active camera, it's showing me what this is looking like. It's not just working with that selected 3-dimensional layer. So I could just jump back into one view for right now. And I want to take this landscape and I want to kind of play around with my positioning here. I want to see a little bit of this moon. And right now it's just a flat object. So now that I have this thing placed in there, it's just going to act as a stacked layer, just like you'd see in Photoshop. But what I want to do is I want to actually make this part of the art. I want to make this interact with the lighting, the camera. So if I don't have this little 3-dimensional box checked, it just acts like its own flat piece and it won't be affected as part of the environment. I need to make this part of that 3D environment. So I'm going to do that by just checking this box. Now, if you take a look, I'll go back into my 4 views. Now, as I'm working, I can take a look at here. This is taking up that whole area. You can see like how I even scaled it out a little bit. So it's working way off. It's just an oversized image. It's much bigger than that 1920. I think it was like 4,000 pixels wide. But now I can see it's part of this environment. It's now showing up in here. So any other pieces that I add to it, anything that I want to play around with, I can adjust that and kind of take a look at it in that 3-dimensional space. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at just kind of where the positioning is for this thing. So if you want to get into specifics, remember you can hit your P and you can play with your adjustments here. So I can slide forwards or backwards, up or down. And when I'm working in 3-dimensional spaces, this isn't the worst idea. And now take a look. I've got that Z-axis because this is a 3-dimensional object. So I can pull this thing way back, or I can bring it way forward. So now if I want to play with like a zoom effect for this thing, because this is 3-dimensional, I can make those adjustments right from that position. So what I want to do now is, now that I've established this, I got my text and I got my background, I have some basic elements for this thing. What I want to do now is I want to take a look at what this thing is going to, how this thing is going to react if I start adding different elements to it. So first thing I'll do is I'll add in a light layer. So the way you're going to do that is I want to make sure too that when my light works, that it starts at the very first frame. I'm going to make sure I'm at the beginning of my time run. I'm going to go up to my layer menu, go up to new, and then notice I've worked with text, I've worked with solids. We haven't really played with lights or cameras yet. We're going to take a look at both of those today. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to set a new light, and it's going to pop out a box and ask me what I want this thing to be called. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a key light. So there's different types of lighting. A key is going to be something that's going to be specific, that's going to shine specifically on an object. Then there's also things called fill lights. Fill lights are just kind of how you'd light the entire room, whereas in a key light would be a very specific light on a subject. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build my key light first, and my light type, notice I've got all these different types here. I'm going to do, instead of ambient, which would just kind of generally light the whole area, I'm going to make sure I set this to spot. For my color, I'm going to go to like a light orange color for this. So I'm going to go in my kind of orange range, and I'm just going to do something real subtle like that. Now I can play with my intensity, so I can turn this up or down. I'm going to set this to full intensity at 100%. For my angle, this is actually going to control what angle this light comes from. I can adjust this. I'm going to start my angle at 90 degrees, and I've got this cone feather at 50%. This just kind of feathers off the edges. So far this is looking good. I'm happy with it. Now, again, I'm not going to be able to preview this yet. Once I have this general one set, I can always go back in and adjust it, because what's going to happen is how we have these different layers here, this light is just going to act like its own layer. There's a question?
Yeah, it doesn't give you an option to preview when you make adjustment, or?
Once we have it in there, it will preview it.
Okay.
And we can always go back and make the adjustment. Right now, this is deselected. It may even be too. So like if I jump back in, let me deselect everything. So layer, new light. Yeah, I'm not sure why, and you guys may run into an issue with this. Even when I was doing like this test demo yesterday, I had some issues with some rendering. Like it was kind of doing some funky stuff, and it might be a quality setting. So there is some adjustments you can kind of play around with on that. But it may just be, as you're working through this, it may just be something that you're going to have to kind of play around with a little bit. Once we actually get into some animation, there's some quality settings that we can kind of play around with that may impact that. And it also will depend on how much RAM you have set on your machine too. So again, key, set to spot. I'm going to jump back in, grab that light orange color. Intensity, I'll set this to 100. My angle's going to be 90. My feather's going to be 50. And I want to make sure that this casts shadows. I want to see that this actually does something. So if the light interacts with this three-dimensional object, that it will cast a shadow on other pieces within that 3D environment. For my darkness, I'm going to set it to 50%. My shadow diffusion, 150. I'll just leave those as default settings for right now. So when I click OK, take a look. Now it's lighting that specifically. Is there a question?
Yeah, what's a shadow diffusion?
Shadow diffusion is going to be how it blends off the edges once a shadow is cast.
Oh, okay.
So now what we've got is this light layer, and you can tell it's a light layer because it's got this little light bulb icon. So that's one way you can determine. So like T is a text layer, here's a photo for an image. So we can tell that we're working off of a light layer. And then there's also this little kind of crosshairs that you'll see, but now you can also see it's created this cone. So now I can see from this angle, I can shift this thing around the environment, and I can kind of start playing around with how this is actually going to impact the angle and the light of this thing. So what I want to do is I want to position this thing real specifically. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit my P button. And again, this thing is going to pull open those parameters. This light is going to act just like any other object. So now I hit that P, I'm showing my position. I'm going to set this to real specific. I'm going to set this to about 950. For next dimension, I'm going to bring this down. And take a look how it's kind of pitching that light down, and take a look at how it's adjusting the environment. If the light source comes from the bottom, now it's lighting that moon area. If I bring it back in the other direction, it's going to pitch that light way down. And if I hit the angle high enough, it'll actually cast a shadow. So I'm going to set this to minus 100 or so. So this is really kicking that light way down, and it should start pitching some of that light and start casting shadows behind it on any area that would be light enough to accept it. And then for this, for my Z, I'm going to back this thing way out so you can see now my Z-axis, I pulled it way back. So now that light is really kicking out across everything, and I'm starting to see like a little bit of shadow behind it. And I don't even have any three-dimensional any depth to this thing yet. This is just like flat text. So it's going to start interacting with that. So the more depth I add to this object, the more shadow it's going to cast. So far, so good. That making sense? All right, so now we've got our spotlight. Now what I want to do is I want to put in another light. I want to put in something called a fill light. I just want to kind of light up the rest of the area. So it's got kind of like it's a little too orange. So what I want to do is I want to fill up the rest of this and kind of bring out a little bit more lightness to it. So I'm going to add in a new light just like I did before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click away. I'm going to collapse all this stuff so I don't see any of these.
So
I'm going to click.
so basically, it's almost like photography, like a photo lighting.
Exactly. That's exactly it. I mean, it's basically you're recreating in a three-dimensional environment. You're recreating those same conditions you'd have like in a studio.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the nice part about this, though, is that you have so much control over how the lights work that you don't have to worry about positioning things or gels or any of that stuff. It's all just controlled within these setups. So I'm going to make sure I got everything deselected down here. I'm going to come back up to my layer. I'll do new, and I'm just going to add in another light. Now for this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this thing a fill. I just want to fill that area. Now for my light type, I'm going to leave it at spot. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to play around with my settings to kind of fill that area out a little bit more. My color, I'm going to bring this thing up to kind of the blues. I want like a nice light blue color. Somewhere there, I think looks good. For my intensity, I want to play around with this. I'm going to knock this back. I don't want it quite so intense. I'm going to set that to 50. For my cone angle, I'll leave that set to 90 degrees. My feather, I'll leave that set at 50. I think that was looking good so far. And then where my cast shadows, I'm going to turn that off. I don't want this to cast shadows. I just want this to kind of generally light everything. So I'll uncheck that and click OK. And now you can see, now it's starting to look a little bit more like a white color. Still got some of that cast in there. So that orange and that blue, they're almost offsetting a little bit, but it's still going to give you kind of that pitch of light. So it'll create those shadows and it'll create kind of that three-dimensional effect. So now that I have my light layer set, and again, I can tell this is a light. I'm seeing my little light bulb icon here in my timeline. What I want to do is I want to play around with my position on this as well. So again, I'm going to adjust where this thing sits on the X, the Y, and the Z axis. So on the first one, I'm going to set this, I'm going to go much bigger with this. Let's set this to 2500. So now you can see it's kicking way off to the side. Second one, I'm going to set this maybe around 350 or so. Just kind of kick that angle over a little bit. And then for my depth, I'm going to bump this thing way back. I'm going to set this one to minus 2002. I want this to come way out as well. So now we can see, here's my two lights. I have one, the spot is kicking from this angle, and the fill is just a big general one that's going to light the whole area. And here I can see my three-dimensional objects. But you can see that kind of balanced my color out a little bit more, but it's almost like a gradient effect where it's kind of, you'll see kind of more around the edges. And it's basically giving me all the conditions that I'm looking for. The only problem is that I don't really see a whole lot of it because I don't have any sort of like depth to any of this stuff. So I got this mix of these warm colors, these cool colors, but again, it's not super three-dimensional because I don't have three-dimensional things on it. So what I want to do is I'm going to play around with something called material properties to start making this look a little bit more three-dimensional. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this, collapse this so I can see everything. I'm going to select my text layer, and I'm going to press my A button once and twice. A twice, it pops open geometry, material options. It's showing me all these different kind of pieces. And what I want to do is I want to take a look at the surface properties of this 3D layer. I want to kind of see how it's going to interact with things. So I've got all these different areas here. It says cast shadows. Well, I want to make sure that that's on. So I'll click on it once. Cool, now this should allow me to cast shadows. Second thing I want to do is I want to take a look at how the light's going to work off of this thing. So I've got these diffuse values. So for this diffuse, I'm going to bump this up a little bit. Now, just like in Photoshop, this is something where you see a slider, go all the way to the left, go all the way to the right, see what it does. So you can see if I turn it up, it kind of turns up that intensity. And I want to bump that up a little bit. I want to kind of have a little bit more light intensity off that surface. And then I've got this specular intensity. Right now, it's defaulted at 50. Let's swing it all the way to the right. Really bright, all the way to the left, really dark. So I'm going to bump this somewhere in that 60 range as well. Now, just like in Photoshop, if you guys took it with me, like I'm a big proponent of like, if you see sliders in an Adobe product, go all the way to the right, go all the way to the left, see what it actually does, because I think that's really going to give you a better idea of kind of the thickness or the effect or the kind of how ridiculous it can get if you go all the way in one direction or all the way in another. And then you can kind of find that subtle blend in between to give you the kind of the look that you're going for. Last thing I'll take a look at is I've got this specular shininess. This kind of controls how reflective or how shiny something looks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that, I'm just going to bump that up to maybe 15 or so. Now again, I'm starting to see a little bit of this effect as I zoom in on it. I can kind of pick up a little bit more of it, but you can see kind of from darker to lighter, it's starting to kind of do a little bit more in terms of like the brightness. Like see it kind of like pitch off the edge a little bit. So it's starting to look a little bit more like there's kind of some depth to it. So now that I have this object with some different properties set, I'm going to hide all these things right now because I want to be able to see the rest of this. And the next thing I want to do is I want to add in a camera to this scene. So the idea is that we've got this 3D scene. We're seeing it from all these different perspectives. But what we can also do is we can view these things from different angles, different distances by setting up something called a camera. So the big idea with a camera is that once you have a camera view for your comp, you can look at it as if you were looking through a camera. So the other part of it that's interesting is that you can set all these different parameters for it. So just like we did before by building a new layer for these lights and how a new layer for text, I'm going to deselect everything. I'm going to go up to my layer menu. I'll go to new, and then I'll go down to camera. So now it pulls up in this camera, and it asks me for some basic settings here. Now you can take a look. There's all these different, there's 1-node or 2-node cameras. We're going to work off of a 2-node camera. My preset, I've got all these different ways that the lenses look. So when you hear about these different millimeter lenses, it's different widths that create different kind of views. I'm going to work off of a 20 millimeter. I can change my zoom, my angles, all these things. I'm not going to mess with focal length or anything like that because that's really what the preset is. I'm just going to leave this as if it was an actual camera at a 20 millimeter. As you adjust those cameras, question?
Yeah, what exactly is like a 2-node camera? Like, is there a difference between those two?
Yeah, with like the difference with nodes is it'll give you kind of like, it's almost like a focal depth. So a 2-node camera is going to give you a little bit better sense of depth with things. So you can kind of play around with settings. And again, like there's no right or wrong answer when you're playing around with this stuff. It's really just kind of testing settings and seeing how things look. But you can see like now that I built this camera, now it's actually showing me where this camera is sitting and how far back it is. So we can control this camera to zoom in or zoom out on the action. And it's just basically another way of changing angles and changing views. So again, like it sounds really complicated. It's really not. It's just a matter of how you can adjust how this thing renders out once you have this 3D environment fully built. That make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So now that I got these two things set, I'm going to change this to 2 views. I'm at 4 right now. I'm going to set this to 2. I want to see my active camera because this is going to basically give me a preview. And then my other one, I'm going to change this on the left-hand side here, this top view. I'm going to change this to right. So with this selected, I'm going to go here. I want to see it from the right side. So here's all my stacked objects. The purple one is, or the kind of maroon one is my camera. And then I've got these great big cones, and these are my lights. So I'm kind of seeing how everything's looking so far. But I think these 2 views are going to give me what I'm looking for in terms of kind of getting everything in an area that kind of makes sense. I'm also going to expand this out a little bit, just so I have a little bit more room here. So here on this, if you want to go in, you can just fit this. So you can always adjust kind of how your view sits. And you can kind of fine tune your windows as you're working. I think like when you're working with 3D spaces, I like to kind of give myself a little bit more room to work. I just think it's a little bit easier when I'm playing around with these objects. All right, now we've got all these different kind of pieces, right? We've got all our elements put together. What I want to do is I want to kind of set up a point of interest on this thing. I really want to make sure that everything is going to the right position. So that's really what that camera is going to do. So I'm going to select this camera, and I want to make sure that this point of interest is exactly where I want it to. So I'm going to make sure that I'm at the 0-second mark. I want to make sure I'm not moving forward at all anywhere. And I'm going to select this camera 1, and I'm going to hit my P to show my position. And again, just like before, I can control the X, the Y, and the Z. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change this and actually make something happen here. I'm going to start playing around with using this camera to animate a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my stopwatch icon. I want to set a frame here. And for my Z axis, I'm going to make sure that this is at -1000. So kind of zoom in a little bit. Now again, I'm not making anything bigger or larger. I'm not growing anything with my actual layers. I'm just using the camera to zoom in and kind of fake that effect for me. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the 1-second mark. Slide this over here. And at the 1-second mark, I'm going to change this. I'm going to make this kind of zoom in a little bit. I'm going to go to -590. And now it pulls right in on that. So as I kind of preview through, and because this is a 3D space, your computer may render this a little bit slower, but it looks like it's just pulling in. Now, I could have gone in and I could have taken my background layer and my text layer, and I could have zoomed, I could have locked them together, and I could have changed the size and scaled them up or down. That's the advantage of using a camera, is I don't have to mess with sizes on anything. I'm just going to make my camera kind of zoom through the environment and make those changes for me. So that's really the big idea. The other thing I want to do is I want to smooth this as it kind of pans in on that text. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this keyframe, and I've got that keyframe assistant, and I'm going to ease this in. So now as it goes through, as we pull in, it's a nice close look at it. It's also going to change how the lighting affects it. So as you move, the way the light works, that will also kind of react as part of the environment. Now, to make this look a little bit more kind of three-dimensional, add a little bit of depth to it, what I want to do is I want to play around with my text. I want to add some actual depth to this thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm using this thing called the Cinema 4D renderer. It's built in, and I'm going to extrude this text. You can use this basically to add thickness or add dimension to anything. So I'm going to expand my little lunar menu. I want to see all the different parts that I have. So I've got text, transform, all the different properties and options. Next to the geometry options, I click this down. What I want to do is I want to add in a renderer to this thing. So let me look here. Weird. I might be running into an issue with this. You guys want to give me just a second? Sorry about this. I ran through this yesterday when I was doing when I was prepping for this, and I had like a weird RAM issue this morning when I actually like loaded everything up and it restarted. I don't know if you guys are going to be running into any of these issues. Has anybody had any updates on theirs?
I've been having a problem with mine. I don't know, something about this particular app is causing me like it'll go and then it'll freeze on me, and I try to make sure I don't have like two other apps on, of course, but it's still going slow and I don't get it.
Yeah, this is.
Because I did remove,
right,
I did have like a virus protector on there. It was I forgot the name of the brand, but I removed it because it was making my stuff even slower. And I don't know, like it's this is the only app that I have a problem with. Other apps like Photoshop, Illustration have no problem. It's just this app.
Yes. See, what you should be seeing here is when you have geometry options selected, there should be an option on the side to adjust the render. I'm not seeing it, but it is giving me my rendering options. So I don't know if that's like if it's maybe from a first time setting, but I'm seeing the actual properties that I need here. So with this, like I've got the object selected, I've got my geometry options, so I can kind of play around with this. What it should allow you to do is adjust the quality. And that's the thing that I'm not seeing here is the Cinema 4D. There should be like, so let me take a look under effect. So underneath Cinema 4D, yeah, it keeps showing me that. Let me pull this open here. Because when I originally set this up, let me see my options. Yeah, it looks like it's there. That's really strange. As I was playing with it, this is where, like with this is where you should be able to set like your rendering options. So when I was playing around with like adjusting this and applying these things on, set this. Yeah, that's really weird. Yeah, and it's not even like actually resetting these things. I'm gonna just kind of wing it on here with these without that setting on there. Normally this is where you can control the quality, and I think that's where I ran into an issue yesterday. As I was rendering mine, as I started making this thing move, I kept like losing angles, So I'm going to just run through without that setting. If you guys do see it, just keep in mind that really when you have that render, it's going to pop up in a window and it's going to ask you for quality settings. Generally, like there's kind of like a slider that shows from like basically full to lesser quality. Let me check under comp settings here. And let me save this thing first. And I probably should have saved this as I was going, just because this tends to be a lot more RAM intensive. Let me do that. Pull this off, okay. And let me get back into my comp settings now. So here's my render. Okay, so here it is, and it is showing it as the 4D. Okay, there we go. So I'm glad that I was able to walk through this with you guys. All right, so once you have your object saved, I'm gonna click away and deselect everything. The first time that you render, you're gonna see under geometry options, it's gonna ask you to select a rendering engine. Because I've already selected one, it looks like it's just locked that in as my preferred rendering engine unless I change it. So if you do want to change that, the way you're going to do it is under composition. You go down to comp settings. And then here we've got a tab for basic. Here's our advanced, and here's our 3D render. That's where we're supposed to be pulling this. So I thought something looked off. Okay, so that's where you can pull your Cinema 4D, and then here it shows all the different options. But what this does is it enables extruding shapes, and that's what I want to do. The other thing here is I can play around with quality. So there's draft versus like high-end production quality. If you're running into issues and your machine is just running really, really slow for this, and again, everyone's going to run on different platforms. I'm running on a fairly new MacBook, but just for the sake of demos, I try to kind of keep it a little bit lower because I'm not doing this for actual production. If I was doing this for like a finished version for a client, what I would actually do is I'd work under a slower draft speed just to get everything where I want it. And then when I'm happy with it, I'll bump this way up once I'm actually going to render out my final version. But for right now, I'm going to just set it kind of somewhere between draft and typical, like a little bit on the lower side. I'll click OK. So that is where we're going to be able to change those options. So now that we have the options, now what we can start doing is playing around with the different depth settings. So we've got this text selected. We're going to control kind of how the edges look and how much depth there is. So for my bevel depth, I'm going to set that to 2. I'll leave that there. I've got this whole bevel depth. I'm going to leave that. But what I want to change is this extrusion. This is how I'm going to add a thickness to it. So now as I add thickness, it's going to render this out, and I can't really see it that well. So what I want to do is I want to start playing around with this axis here, and I want to rotate this a little bit. So now I can see it's going to take a second to render it out, but now you can see how the lighting changes. Let me change my angle a little bit. But now I can kind of play around with all these different ways of rotating. And notice too that if I rotate them, I'm seeing this here, and I'm seeing how it's going to kind of lay against all the different text. So now if I rotate this up, I can kind of play around with that angle and kind of make it match where my lighting hits. But now I'm starting to see that. I am still, and I think this is a quality issue, that how it's kind of clipping off that edge. I can see that my light is shining right on it. So I'm going to just work with this for right now, and as I go through, like I can always adjust the render on the back end. There we go. And then again, here, if I want to make this a little bit thicker or not, I can maybe bump that out to about 60. And that's going to add a little bit more depth in that area. So now that I have all this kind of adjusted in, I can see that as I render this thing forward, this is where it's going to start acting really slow for you. So you can see as I'm sliding through, I can see what my camera is doing and what it's kind of zooming in on in the environment. So as you're going through, if you're going to run into any issues, it's probably going to be at this point in terms of your machine running really fast or really slow. So again, if you have any issues, go back into that comp settings, check on your renderer, and adjust your quality. You can bring this down a little bit. That should help. Yeah, and it looks like it's being a little bit more snappy now with my preview. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to animate some text. I'm going to add in a little bit more and just kind of make it animate in. So What I'll do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to make one more new layer. So I'll right click, a new text layer pops in, and I'm going to just pop in like basically just a kind of a subtitle for this thing. Okay. Here's my text. I'm going to go way down on this, and I'm going to change my font too. Let's do just something like this. I'm just going to do a regular. I'm going to bring my size down to maybe about half that. And I'm going to slide this down. I want it to pop up kind of right underneath there. Now what I want to do is I want to make this thing a three-dimensional object. So I'm going to check on 3D. And I want to pay attention to where this thing is in my stacking order because I want this to go underneath my lighting and my camera. I want this to actually be part of this 3D environment. So when I check this, it becomes part of the 3D environment. Then I want to change my stacking order so that it's underneath, so that the lights and the cameras all affect the actual object in the environment. Now, same thing, I'm going to expand this thing out. Because it is a 3D, I get to play with these geometry options. So for my bevel style, I'm going to change this thing to concave. For my bevel depth, I'll leave it at 2. And for my extrusion, I'm going to make this thing pop out. I'm going to do a little depth, but not quite as much. I'll set this to about 20. And I want to take a look at my material options too. So I'm going to right click or click on this. And here I've got all these different objects. I don't want this thing to cast shadows. I'm going to leave that set to off. It'll accept shadows, it'll accept lights, it'll appear in reflection. So I want all that to happen. My diffuse value, I'm going to bump this up a little bit. My shininess and my reflections, I want all those settings to match. So for that intensity, I'll set that to around 60 as well. And my shininess 15. Now again, I'm just matching these settings out because I want these things to look complementary to each other. That's really the big idea behind this. Now, next thing I want to do is I'm going to collapse this, and I'm going to hit R to see the rotation, and now I can see, because I have a three-dimensional object, I have these 3 different ways I can rotate it. I'm going to change my Y rotation. I'm going to turn it up, kind of to the side a little bit. And if I want, I can kind of play around with that Z rotation. I'm just going to try and match it a little bit to the settings I had on the other one. And then my X rotation, I can play around with rotating this up. And I'm going to rotate this up a little bit so it's kind of facing the light, just like the other one did. Z rotation a little bit. I think that's pretty good. Now, because this is all in a three-dimensional environment, if I jump forward to that 1 second mark, it's going to render everything forward, and I don't have to do anything. It's already built in there. So I gave it my start position, I set my settings, and the camera is going to do all the heavy lifting. It's going to do all the animation, all that for me. So you can see that that's really the big idea of the benefit of working with these three-dimensional spaces. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to throw an effect on this thing just to see how it works. I had just kind of like, because of just rendering issues, and especially because like I'm screencasting all this stuff to you guys as well, my machine just kind of bogs down a little bit, but we'll try it here. With my space pod, my layer selected here, I'm going to take a look underneath my effects. So I'll go to Window, Effects and Presets. There's a text effect called Fly In with a Twist. I'm going to give that one a shot. Effects, Animate, Fly In with a Twist. I'm going to drop it on here. And it should start happening. So all the pieces start kind of sliding in. And I can see kind of how the lines are going to pop all out. Now, what I'm going to do is I have that effect in there. I'm going to take a look at my animator because I animated this thing, and I'm going to take a look at my settings on my animator. So I'm pulling this down, I'm going down in this range selector, and it's showing me where it starts and where it ends. Remember, I'm at the 0 second mark here. So for my start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to where these keyframes are, and I want that second keyframe at about the 2-second mark, so it kind of appears more quickly. So here where I've got this keyframe, I can take this and I can kind of slide this in for the start point. So I can bring this in, or if I wanted to start a little bit later, so I can adjust my timing on this thing by adjusting those keyframe markers. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to play around with opacity so that this thing, kind of as this text starts flying in, that it starts fading in at a certain point. So what I'll do is I'll go to right around the 10-second mark, or the 10 frame mark. I'm going to turn on my opacity. So remember, I'm going to press T so I can see that. So at that 10-second mark, I'll leave it at 100. And I'm just going to go, or at the 10 frame mark, I'm going to go back 1 frame. And I'm going to set it to 0. And then I can kind of make this thing as it's flying in, it'll kind of render. And again, if I want to adjust where that keyframe is, I can kind of adjust that point there. So if I want to make it go in a little bit faster, a little bit slower. Now, I'm going to change this stuff back to one view. I just want to see my main view. Let's see if I can fit this thing. So hitting your spacebar is how it's going to play back. This thing is going to play back really, really slow. It's going to have to render this thing out 1 frame at a time to start showing me all the effects. So you can see right now, it's showing me the frame rate. It's not in real time. So as it goes through and plays back, it's going to need to render all that. There is one thing we need to add onto this too. I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to double click in my project. I'm going to grab that MP3 and open it. I'm going to throw it down in the bottom here. Now, because I've added a new object, now it's got to render all that as well. So as you're kind of going through, anytime you make an adjustment, this little green progress bar has to rebuild itself. So because this is taking so long, I'm not going to make you guys like sit and watch something render. Again, you can kind of see the effect and see what's happening with it. Then once you're done with this, final step is going to be to go in and always make sure you save a copy of this before you do anything. And then I'm going to export this thing in. I'm going to throw this into the media encoder. This especially because there's just so much to it and you're working in a 3-dimensional environment. This is not just straight up like animating some basic or exporting some basic layers. You're working with lights, cameras, different angles, different things happening. There's depth and dimension to it. This is going to run a lot slower when you output this. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're working, especially if you're working on an older machine, make sure you're saving every couple of steps. And then when you're done, make sure you just give yourself like a half hour, 45 minutes, depending on what your machine looks like, to actually render this final piece out. So that's the idea of working in 3-dimensional environments. It's just kind of a warm up. The big takeaway I want you guys to get from this is that you could just throw basic stuff into a project, but once you start adding in those lighting and camera, it starts giving you a lot kind of cooler effects with it, and a lot kind of more control without having to go in and like a simple zoom effect. Now you're just doing it with one thing. You're doing it with a camera instead of doing it with a bunch of other things and making everything kind of work at the same pace. So this kind of gives you a little bit better idea of that. My media encoder just loaded up. Let's see if it gives me, I'm gonna play it back and see. When I rendered out my sample project yesterday, I had it at a higher quality and it still took about 15 minutes on my machine. So it's gonna take some time. I have my rendering set a little bit lower on this. So again, keeping in mind that like however this looks right now, you can always just go back in your comp settings now that you're done. I'm gonna click away, I'm gonna save this thing. So now if I did want to change my render and I want my settings up, now that all my actual animation is done, I can click OK. It's gonna need to pre-render everything, but now I could re-encode this thing and save that out now that I've got kind of a full version. Right now it's estimating my time on this on my lower setting at about 7.5 minutes. If I render this thing out at those higher settings, it's going to probably, I would guess probably 30, 35 minutes. So, but I got to let this thing render through first anyways. So that is a big idea with working in 3-dimensional spaces. What we're going to do next week is, now that we understand kind of the basics of a 3D environment, we're going to create a 3D scene and we're going to actually play with camera tracking and kind of do a little bit, something a little bit different with with that 3D camera option in that environment. So as far as just kind of getting stuff wrapped up and looking forward into the rest of the semester, we're kind of getting close. We've basically got a month left. So what we're going to do is next week, we're going to take a look at lesson 13. We're going to play around with camera tracking, working in 3-dimensional spaces that way. I'm going to introduce the final project next week. If you guys want to jump ahead, it's up and active in the project session or section of Blackboard. I'm not going to hit on it this week. I just want you guys to kind of play around with this and focus and kind of get a chance to work with it. Just keep your patience with this because it may run a little bit slower. So again, keeping in mind those quality settings, that's going to make a huge difference for you guys. So next week, lesson 13, we're going to introduce the final project. Next week is going to be the last of like these formal lessons. As we meet over the next couple of weeks while you guys are working on your final project, there are some additional things I'm going to show you guys, like camera tracking and stabilization, just kind of a couple other like little odds and ends things that are kind of helpful just to know about. But honestly, like we've kind of burned through this whole book. Like you guys have definitely gotten a good baseline of After Effects. I think now the real help is going to be just you guys getting a chance to kind of create some stuff and play around with it a little bit more. So any questions on this? Anything jumping out, you guys?
Nope. Thank you.
Cool. So if you guys have any questions, I'll be hanging out in the room. Otherwise, that is what I got for you guys for this week. So thank you.